Today we're going to talk about a pretty hot topic around here, and that is steak thickness. We're going to talk about thin steaks and how to cook them. We're going to talk about thick steaks and how to cook them. And we're going to talk about steaks that are kind of in the middle and the different philosophies for cooking, grilling, however you want to make them ready to eat that you might want to apply, and things that hold true for one that might not for another, and vice versa. So if you're curious to learn a little bit more about how thickness affects cooking steaks, hang around. We're going to head down the rabbit hole. All right, so we're going to dive in on thin steaks. Now, the first thing that I'm going to say is that thickness or thinness is very subjective, and what's thin to one person might be thick to another. And when we're talking about thin steaks, what I'm specifically referring to is steaks that are sub 3/4 inch, more in that 1/2 inch thick, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch thick range. Thin steaks, while people will order them for a variety of reasons, typically portion seems to be the biggest one, and primary reasons. You know, oh, I want a smaller ribeye, so I'll get a 10-ounce ribeye. Well, the cross section on a ribeye is pretty good size. So by the time you cut a 10-ounce steak out of a large cross section of a ribeye, it can get down to 3/4 of an inch or even a little bit thinner sometimes. So to properly cook that steak, the trick is high heat. And by high heat, I mean really high heat. You want to get that steak on, and for a thinner steak like a 10-ounce ribeye or something of that nature, an 8-ounce strip maybe, I like a really hot cast iron skillet with some tallow, and then sear it just long enough to get a nice caramelized crust on both sides. Season it, sear both sides, let it rest, and that steak's going to end up pretty darn close to a perfect medium rare. But we're talking total cook time, probably under 5 minutes. In fact, I would say probably closer to 3. So thin steaks, high temp, low time to hit that perfect medium rare. Now, again, thick and thin is subjective, but if you belong to our SMS club, you've seen steaks that are up to 3 inches thick, and spoiler alert, you're gonna see some even thicker coming up here because they sell so well. So when we're talking about a thick steak, I'm talking 2 inches minimum and up from there. Now, cooking a steak like that takes different handling than the thin steak that we talked about, where we're talking high temp, short time. The trick with a thick steak, a big steak, you know, a 40-ounce ribeye, something of that nature, 48-ounce Florentine porterhouse, you want to get the internal temperature of that steak to where you want it, you know, in that 120, 125 range for a medium rare before you ever go to the sear. So it's a process we refer to as a reverse sear. You can do it via sous vide, you can do it on the grill, you can do it in the oven. Any way that you like to bring the internal temperature of that thick cut steak up to the temperature that you like is the right way to do it. Typically, we're gonna lean towards lower temp, so lower temp, longer time to get the internal temp where we want it. Then we're gonna go to a sear. Now, on a big steak, I personally prefer a wood-fired grill, you know, campfire style, burn it down to ashes, don't be cooking on green wood. But nice wood fire or charcoal for the sear, that adds some flavor, that adds some dimension. On a steak like that, it deserves it. Yeah, it's a little more work. Anyway, thick steaks, lower temp, longer time to get the internal temperature right, and then sear it nice. That's how you handle a thicker steak. The steaks that we would refer to around here as our classic cuts. And these are gonna be steaks that are typical of what you find in the grocery store. They're steaks that are cut the way the majority of people cut steaks or like steaks cut. somewhere in that inch to inch and a half thick range. 14 to 16 ounce ribeye, 12 to 14 ounce New York strip, 10 to 16 ounce sirloin, depending on how the sirloin's cut, 8 to 10 ounce filet. So that's what I'm considering an in the middle cut. Now, we talked about low time, high temp on the thin steak. We talked about low temp, long time on the thick steak. For the steaks in the middle, what I've found to be best with those is something in the middle. I typically won't run as high a temp as the thin cut steak, but I'd still like to run a fairly high temp, whether that's the grill, cast iron, skillet. I don't do too many of this type of steak in an oven. Typically I want surface heat, and then I want that surface heat to migrate through to get the internal temp where I want it. So we're gonna go higher heat, but not high heat. And as far as time, it kind of ends up somewhere in the middle. And again, I'm not really looking at time as much as I'm looking at internal temperature. With the thin cut steak, time is quick. I mean, it's gonna go really quick. The internal temperature, honestly, is hard to hit. You wanna sear both sides, that's gonna be medium rare. That's probably the most artistic, also the trickiest steak to cook, in my opinion. The medium cut steaks, or the middle of the road steaks, really watch the internal temperature. Get the sear on the first side, but it's gonna take a little longer. You wanna be flipping that steak at maybe 95 degrees, 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. Then when you flip it, get the second side seared and bring it up to about 10 degrees below where you want the finished internal temperature to be. The fact that the steak's thicker and has spent more time in contact with the heat, whether that's a grill surface or a cast iron skillet, the fact that it's been in contact with that heat for a longer period of time means there's going to be more heat migration towards the center. So pull that steak 10 degrees below where you want to serve that steak, and then give it, 5-10 minutes to rest. And that is something that for all of the cuts, I will always recommend, whether that's a thin cut steak or the thickest cut steak, let that rascal rest. Minimum 5 minutes. 10's not bad. Medium cut steaks, high temp, watch the internal temperature of the steak. It's gonna take more than just putting a sear on it unless you're going for a blue rare steak. And when the internal temp's where you want it to be, pull it off, let it rest, and get ready for some goodies. All right, so that's everything I know about cooking steaks from thin to thick and everything in between. Hope you enjoyed the content. If you did, hit the like button. If you really liked it, we wouldn't mind if you subscribed at all. And go eat a steak.